Okay, so curious question. Would you allow yourself to be imprisoned and remain imprisoned because of a story that you created that you knew wasn't true? Where'd they do that at? There's an old saying that we've all heard before that history is written by the victors. What that essentially means is that whoever is victorious, whoever is the conqueror, will tell the tale in the way that they want to tell it. Now, the opposite of this is what's called the criterion of embarrassment. This is a type of historical analysis in which a historical account is deemed likely to be true under the inference that the author would have no reason to invent a historical account which might embarrass them. In short, whoever writes a historical account is nearly always the protagonist of their own story. For example, when a pharaoh or a general, a warlord, or a nation conquered a land or a people, the retelling of that event will include all the good stuff about the conquest. It's extremely rare in history that the victor would document how badly they lost or that they were humiliated during the process. That seems to be self evident. Wouldn't you agree? Sounds like common sense. Really shouldn't be up for debate, right? So I bet you're wondering, how do these concepts relate to the biblical narratives? Well, let's be clear about a couple of things. First and foremost, Jesus Christ was a conqueror. Understand that death no longer has a hold over us because of him. So ask yourself this question. If it were you who had conquered death, would you have written about that as a result of you being humiliated, spat upon, mocked, flogged, and nailed to a cross? Or would you have told that story as a conquering hero who stood tall and brought death to submission? Conventional wisdom and historical documentation suggest that 99 out of 100 of these stories would take option two. With all that said, I still choose to take the approach with respect to the criterion of embarrassment in the way Dr. William Lane Craig suggests, by making more modest claims in the debate. I realize now that going directly to death and martyrdom may come across a little too extreme. So, the more modest approach is to introduce voluntary suffering in the name of a fake story. Take the Apostle Paul, for example. We know that Paul wrote at least four of his epistles from prison, the famous prison epistles. They include Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And Clement of Rome attests that Paul was imprisoned at least seven times. In all of these epistles, the consistent theme was preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, does that sound like something a man would subject himself to if he knew the content of his letters was fraudulent? I won't answer that for you. But before anyone makes a light of Paul's circumstance, because we see prison through modern day lenses, even though prison is still not ideal even today, we are talking about first century Roman prison. So take the worst aspects of what you think prison today is, ratchet that thing up by about 100. I think it's safe to say that Paul genuinely believed what he was preaching was true because he gained nothing from it and lost almost everything. Again, this seems like common sense. However, I recently ran into an objection to this kind of evangelism and apologetic. Apparently, there are some who don't view the criterion of embarrassment as valid because it sets new Christians up for failure because they will supposedly learn later that the claims are untrue or unverified historically. What I found interesting in the objection to the criterion of embarrassment and how that criterion helps validate the New Testament text is that this scholar had to jump herself to extreme claims to try to argue against it. She started talking about how the apostles' deaths and martyrdoms were exaggerations and couldn't be validated historically. This is exactly why I value modesty in our claims. Quite frankly, simply being imprisoned 7 times in a first century Roman jail is enough for me to have confidence in that what was being written was earnestly believed. And in this case, what the Apostle Paul wrote. It's really interesting. Now, there is so much more to be said on this topic, and you can find that on the Of Things Eternal podcast. But for now, lean into your common sense with regard to this topic. Paul allowed himself to be imprisoned because he regarded the things of this world to be secondary. Instead, he valued things eternal. God bless you and thank you.